Hello and welcome to day 2 of the Aspen Global Congress on Scientific Thinking and Action. We're thrilled that you could join us today for this public event. We had a terrific first day yesterday with both a public keynote, first session, and then breakout discussions with our participants who span more than 50 countries. Today's session is called Science Literacy and Popularization, Understanding How Science Works. Unfortunately, our designated chair for this session, Richard Gallagher, was unable to make it, but stepping in his place will be my Congress co-chair, Natalia Pasternak. She will say a few words about Richard and his organization and then hand it over to our panelists.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon and evening. We have so many time zones here. Unfortunately, Richard was sick today. He had a really bad bout of sciatica and couldn't join us, but he was really sad because he really put a lot of effort into it. And I wanted to explain a little bit about his work and what he does for science popularization, so that we can pay a tribute to his work and all the effort he put into organizing this session. And then I'll introduce all our speakers. So Richard is the CEO of a science publishing company called Annual Reviews that specializes in expert surveys across more than 50 fields of research. And these have been traditionally been seen as publications by and for the scientific community, and they became an archive of an intellectual history of science that can assist and understand research. But Richard wanted to move forward and to bring science closer to the lay people, and he also wanted this material to benefit a wider society. And so now he's also publishing a science popularization magazine called Knowable. Knowable is publishes journalist written articles, videos, cartoons, and even has a podcast. And all the content in Knowable magazine is published under a Creative Commons license. And Knowable is not only just free to read, it is also free to republish. So numerous publications and websites from the Washington Post, Atlantic Magazine, BBC Futures, Smithsonian Magazine, and even specialist publications like Beekeeping Magazine and small town newspapers have been using his content to serve their readers. He has some known English language partners who are interested in working with him so he can cater to an even larger community. He's been doing an excellent work, and I really advise you to check his website on Knowable magazine and have a look at all the brilliant articles and science popularization work that he's putting through. So to talk about this session today, unfortunately, he couldn't be here, and I'll do my best, but I know that I will be a very poor replacement for a man who has put so much effort and has so much expertise in science popularization. We are going to talk a little bit about how science works. So generating interest in the process by which science operates seems like a very daunting task, but it could be the most powerful way to spread science literacy if we can make it relevant and interesting for our citizens. Richard made a point to acknowledge all the time zones that we put together in this Congress so that you can have a look of how really global our participants are. And he started by saying that he's in San Francisco, so it should be 6 a.m. there if he were here. I'm in Sao Paulo, where it's 10 a.m. And if we cross over the Atlantic to meet our first speaker, Simon Singh, it's 1 p.m. there, and Simon was a particle physics researcher at CERN before becoming hugely influential as a reporter, a broadcaster, and a director, and as a producer of the Theatre of Science, as the author of popular books, including Fermat's Last Theorem and the Code Book that became equally popular, and as a fearless debunker of physics books and alternative medicine. So this is Simon Singh, who will be sharing the screen shortly. If we go further east, we can visit Ayelet Baram-Tsabari in Haifa, Israel, where now, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ayelet, should be 3 p.m. Ayelet is a professor at Technion, the Israel Institute of Technology, as well as a commentator and popularizator of science. And she's the founder of the Israeli Science Communication Conference series. Ayelet's research bridges science education and science communication. She explores people's interest in science and how to build on that to teach and communicate science in more meaningful and personally relevant ways. She also supports scientists in becoming more effective communicators. Thank you for that. And shalom, Ayelet. If we keep going east, we will meet Masataka Watanabe, who is in Sendai, Japan right now. So good evening to you, Masataka. He's originally a biologist, but he switched to freelance writing 35 years ago. Writing remains one of his passions. He has written over a dozen books and translated more than 50 English popular science books into Japanese, including The Origin of Species and the works of Stephen Jay Gould. Among his other activities are teaching science communication. He is about to begin a position at Doshisha University in Kyoto and studying cool Japan science culture, looking at the influence of manga, comics, and other components of pop culture on science literacy. You soon get to meet Masataka. And I missed Stuart here in Richard Notes, but it's okay because I happen to know Stuart very well. So to introduce Stuart, he is the chair of the biology department at Columbia University, and he's also the author of several science popularization books. He has been working with science communication and popularization for several years, and he is probably one of the best well-known authors in olfactive issues. Let me see if I can find something better about you, Stuart, because there was something really interesting about your neuroscience works. Here it is. So he's a neuroscientist and he has major contributions to understanding the olfactory system of vertebrates. I was looking for good words to put it, but actually he puts it really informally. It's how do I smell? So his contributions to public understanding of science include working with a theater company and playwrights to incorporate science into performance. So sorry about that, Stuart, and I hope you can forgive me because we are about to start working together at Columbia University. So please forgive me for this, but you can introduce yourself much better. With this, so I guess I properly introduce everybody, and I apologize again for not being Richard, but I'll do my best. And I'll move on to Ayelet now to start the interviews with that round robin format that you saw yesterday. So Ayelet, please take the floor and the show is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Natalia. It's lovely being here, and I'm really, really excited to be interviewing Simon Singh. So Simon, show yourself, please.
Oh, here we go. There we go. Great. Hi, Ayelet.
Hello. So many of us really know you for many years as a gifted author of popular science books, but in the last few years, you've invested a lot of time and energy into your charity, Good Thinking, that seeks to educate and inform the public. So can you tell us a little bit about the successes that you had?
Yes, we're a very small charity. We used to have a part-time person, Laura, who is fantastic, and we still have a full-time person who's Michael Marshall, who people may come across in the next couple of days. And because we're so small and we have a very limited budget, we tend to just look at projects which nobody else is interested in, so we think we can really make a difference, and projects which are achievable. So for example, one of the things we've tried to do is combat the amount of homeopathy in the National Health Service. We did that for about 5 years, and gradually, by lobbying, by arguing, by using a little bit of legal pressure, we've been able to reduce radically the amount of homeopathy being offered by the National Health Service. You know, legally, the NHS has to justify its treatments on offer, how it's spending taxpayers' money, and if there's no evidence, then we can argue that case. So, yeah, we take small battles and we try and win them, and we hope to make a big difference.
So you're working at the level of policymakers and funding, or are you also working at the level of audiences?
I think not so much with audiences, because I just think it's very hard to inform the public in a big way. You know, we just can't. My view is it's easier to protect the public by looking at regulators. So we also work with the advertising regulator to try and stop misleading adverts. Because, you know, my background's in physics, but if you show me an advert about some immune treatment, some treatment that's going to boost my immunity, I know nothing about the immune system. And it's going to be very hard to educate me about the immune system to a level to which I can then evaluate the evidence myself. So we very much tend to work with the regulators. So similarly, you know, we've worked with the Charities Commission to say, look, if somebody wants to have charitable status, if they want to do good, do they have evidence that they are doing good? So regulators is really the level at which we work at. I suppose in a way, the overlap with educating the public, if we want to use that phrase, one of Laura's responsibilities was to interact with the media. So if there was a false claim made on the media, or irresponsible reporting, or what we call false balance, Laura would make sure there was a complaint. And when she made the complaint, she would make sure it wasn't ignored. So, you know, again, I think that's the way we could make the biggest change, would be to try and keep the media as accurate and as honest and as responsible as possible.
So this is really interesting in general and specifically for me, because I used to be for 2 years in Israel part of a body of regulators for the commercial television and radio. And I remember one of the hardest thing, I came into that regulator trying to do what you're doing, and whatever I tried to do, they just said, no, that's free speech. You cannot tell people what to say. You cannot tell people not to say it unless you show that it's a lie. You can't tell them not to say it. So how do you? I know that you personally had to work with this problem.
Yeah, well, the thing is, we have different regulators for different broadcasters, and so the BBC regulator, for example, is one that's, I think, quite responsive. And if the BBC lowers its standards, then I feel everybody else lowers its standards in the UK. So we particularly tried to work with the BBC regulator because they would listen to us and they would set the standard in a way for some of the other channels. And the BBC had a report conducted by Steve Jones, the biologist from the University College London. And he looked at the science reporting at the BBC, and he said, one of the things he highlighted was the issue of false balance. There's no point having a crazy person talking nonsense and saying, well, that's okay, we had a professor here explaining the real science. That's not good journalism. It is kind of free speech, but it's not good journalism. And therefore, he very much said, yeah, false balance is a failure of the BBC and it shouldn't be tolerated. And this really goes back to issues around vaccination, where the BBC used to say, oh, here we have somebody who's an anti-vaccine person, and here's a person who's a pro-vaccine person. Let's have a big argument and see what comes out of it. I think the BBC learned from that that's not how you do a service to the public. And so, yeah, the free speech argument doesn't really work. It's a trickier one with things like phone-ins. You know, we want people to phone in. We want people to have their opinions put on air. That's a trickier area to look into.
So I think one of the problems we saw was with experts in morning shows and lifestyle shows, that I think like half of the show could be, you know, experts who are naturopath and homeopath and chiropath and all the other alternative treatments, and some of them were actually paying to be there. And the commercial channels would really not like us to get involved with that at all. So how would you tackle that?
Well, I think the first thing is you have to try and tackle it, because the first time I ever made a complaint to the BBC, it was about an operation involving heart surgery in Shanghai. Mm-hmm. And the narrator said, this woman is only receiving acupuncture. Gosh, a major surgery with just acupuncture? This was incredible. And I did some digging, I did some research, and I found out that actually she'd received some major drugs like fentanyl. She'd received so many sedatives that it didn't matter that she didn't have a general anesthetic, and the acupuncture was just cosmetic. So I submitted a complaint to the BBC, it was rejected. I submitted it again, it was rejected. I took it to the highest level, they eventually upheld the complaint. But the reason I'm telling that story is because nobody else complained, okay? There were heart surgeons who saw that. There were anaesthetists who saw that. There were many, many people better qualified than me who could have made a complaint. And so unless we make the complaint, nothing ever changes. And when we make the complaint, we have to be tenacious. We can't just allow our complaint to be rejected. We need to keep on pursuing it to the highest level if necessary. But I should also say that, you know, often a complaint just starts off with a little letter to a journalist saying, look, you covered this story, I think you got it wrong. Look, if you need some help, I can help you sometimes, or give me a ring if you're doing another story on this subject. And can you change the online article? You know, it doesn't have to be a big formal complaint. It can be a friendly chat. Now, if the friendly chat doesn't work, I sound like I'm a gangster now, then you need to call in the heavyweight. It's but often journalists just don't know any better. And you know, it's a difficult job, but you know, maybe we can help them as much as complain about them, but we need to also make sure we complain.
That's really interesting what you're saying. So it reminds me a little bit of the joke about the guy that sits and cries all the time because he never wins the lottery. And at some point, the angels come to God and say, please, no, look at him. He's so miserable. Just let him win the lottery. And God says, yeah, but he never bought the ticket. So you say we just don't complain, and then we complain why they don't accept our complaints.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now I remember when I was doing my PhD, and we would see some terrible science on TV, and then we'd moan about it at coffee the next morning, at the tea break or whatever. But you've got to do more than just moan about it. You have to follow these formal processes. So yeah.
Okay. So I have a slightly different question, but we can see, I think, the connection. So I think in many of, well, if what I read about your charity and what I know of your career, much of it is about making the information accessible and understandable to different publics. But what we know from research and what we saw, for example, with COVID-19 vaccination and other issues like that, is that when you need a behavioral change, trust matters so much more. So for example, if I look at the big discussions about vaccination here in Israel, because we're just at the end of the vaccination campaign for COVID-19, and people really talk about their trust in the government, their trust in the scientific community or the medical community or the big pharma or whatever. They don't really talk about the mRNA and how mRNA vaccines are superior or not superior to some other technology. So if we're after behavioral change and persuasion, shouldn't we invest more as a community in trust building?
Yeah,
Simon, just to let you know that this, if you can wrap it up after this answer and we move on, just because of time, because it's so good to hear you. But
sure.
thank you.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I'm trying to remember, there was a name of an author, maybe it's a popular term, but the idea of a credibility spectrum, the idea of you know, we all have different sources that we trust. And if I trust my local homeopath, then I'm going to get all my information from them. If my trust is in the internet, I have a different source of information. If my trust is my local doctor, I have a different source of information. So I think we just have to help people work out who they should trust. And if they put their trust in the right people, because then I don't think we can educate people. I can't be educated enough to make a good decision about vaccination. I have to trust someone, and luckily I think I trust my GP, or I trust the chief medical officer, and so on. So I agree. So thank you very much, Ayelet. So thank you. I'll have to say goodbye to you now, I think.
Thank you. It was lovely.
And I'll say hello to Masa. So hi Masa, how are you doing?
Hi, Simon.
So as you've heard, Masa is president of the Japanese Association for Science Communication. He's written several popular science books and co-authored also books on popular science and science communication and the history of science. And I wanted to start, Masa, by just asking you, in terms of science communication in Japan, what sort of role are books playing today? Are people still reading lots of science books? Are they going more online? Are there new science writers emerging? How is it looking in Japan?
Yes, we have so many popular science books, and also many translations from the foreign science book, including of yours. You are a very popular science writer in Japan. I like your book about the Big Bang.
Thank you.
And
so
yes, but recently the younger generation don't read many books, and one reason is price of the book is very high. So most popular publishing style in Japan is this one, like a penguin books, very small paperbacks. And this is one of them about the science, mathematics.
But Masa, is it in a way? So I haven't written a book for 8 years, and part of my reason is thinking that people don't read books as much, and that's great because there is so much wonderful science writing online. There are fantastic blogs, there are humorous blogs, there's great video content, there are long articles, there are specialist articles. So do you feel that's a good thing that there's now so much variety online, or do you think that ultimately just damages the amount of science that people read?
Yes. Now, so many people get scientific information from the SNS, and once almost all Japanese people get scientific information from the newspapers. The biggest newspaper company in Japan, the Yomiuri Shimbun, published the daily newspaper about 5 million copies a day. But recently, young people don't read newspaper, just get from the internet. And once we had done several popular science magazines, but now we have just one or two. But in Japanese newspapers, we have a special pages for science twice a week. So all elder people still read newspapers, and they get scientific information from the newspapers.
But you were saying about younger people not reading newspapers.
No,
but
no.
I guess younger people do enjoy reading manga comics. I know adults do as well. But and I know you have a particular interest in how science can be communicated via manga comics. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, yes. Japanese manga. Yes, manga is a very popular genre in Japan, and many Japanese people read the manga. Not only younger generation, but also elder peoples. And this is one of the manga comic, and this is a very funny book. The characters are immune cells, and the title is Cells at Work. This is the English version. And
okay, what's the English title?
Cells at Work. Cells
Okay.
at Work.
Right.
And she is a red blood cell, and he is a white blood cell.
Classic story.
Yes. And this is very popular in Japan, and it has sold 5 million copies in 6 volumes. And it has a we have a anime version or something else that. And like this one, recently many artists and creators in the manga field are incorporating science as a material for their works. And this author came up with this idea of creating this work after being asked by her sister, high school students who are studying for cells in biology classes. And the author thought, oh, it's a good idea. And she drew this first version of this manga comics.
Does she have a scientific background or?
No, no, not at all.
Not at all, okay.
So she learned many things by herself from books or from internet. And she make stories about the blood cells. And this manga had gotten a good reputation, and so many readers. And readers enjoyed learning about bodies and illnesses through this work. And I think the important thing is this is not a manga for studying science.
It's not a textbook.
Not textbook. This is just an entertainment work. Therefore, it was accepted so many people, I think.
And just, I don't know how much time we have left, but just in terms of other ways that science is being communicated in popular culture in Japan, in either theater or comedy, are there any other avenues?
Yes, and we have several TV programs. In that TV program, some comedians who have some scientific literacy talk about science or something else. And the comedians who are there are comedians who are fish nerds or insect nerds or railway enthusiasts.
In the UK, we have quite a few comedians who are, they're scientists, or they're atheists, or they're rationalists, and they very much make science and rationalism part of their humor. So and because people like them, people find them funny, they buy into the ideas that they're trying to convey. It's a really nice way to convey science and make science attractive, because young people see that science is something that, not that you laugh at, but that can be humorous and light, but also quite vicious as well. So yeah, okay. I'm just wondering if that tower of books at the back is ever going to fall down. It's a very scary tower of books over your other shoulder, but I would. That's a gravity question. So in terms of, I know you've translated 50 books from English into Japanese, including Stephen Jay Gould is one of the books that you've been translated, which must be 30 books almost on its own. But are books like the manga comic you just showed us, I guess there are books in Japanese that we should be reading over here in England and in the rest of the world. There are writers who could be translated. Is there any effort to translate Japanese books into other languages?
Sorry to barge in again, just to let you know it's time to wrap up. Sorry.
Okay. I tell you what, I'll say goodbye to you, Mas. I'll leave that one hanging. Thank you for your questions, and I'll catch people later in the breakout room.
Thank you. Okay. Hi, Stuart.
Hello, Masa. How are you this morning? Well, this evening.
Thank you. Yes, it's our turns. And you are a university professor, scientist, and also science writer. You wrote several books. I found your Japanese edition, your books in Japanese editions.
Yes, I'm sorry you weren't the translator.
Yes, yes.
No. I had no choice in that, unfortunately.
And you were talking about the uncertainty. Yes. Uncertainty or probability is a very hard thing to understand for the general public. What do you think about it?
Yes, I guess I think that's actually one of the biggest challenges in science communication right now is to communicate the value, the upside, if you will, the positive side of uncertainty, because that's where science has moved to now. Unfortunately, I feel that an awful lot of the science we teach and that we talk about is mired in a kind of 19th century science of determinism, where we thought that the universe could be pretty well explained in a few mathematical formulae, and ultimately we would know this. You know, we'd all know what the magic number was or what the few formulae were to kind of explain everything and predict everything, and that the universe was this kind of clockwork place that we could explain. And I feel that an awful lot of science and science communication and education is still stuck in that kind of idea about science. But that changed radically, I think, well, beginning with Charles Darwin, actually, who is known as the father of modern biology, but I think actually had an extremely important effect on all of science, because Darwin showed that that you could get tremendous complexity and organization, life, out of a totally random process with a feedback loop, which he called natural selection, of course, not having the word for feedback loop. And that really it was randomness all the way down, if you will, or uncertainty that governed things, that the universe was built upon. And that quickly spread to other sciences, you know, statistical mechanics and Boltzmann and relativity and quantum mechanics and undecidability in mathematics and so forth, even chaos theory. I mean, we have a science that actually is called chaos theory. But I think we've failed to communicate the value of uncertainty to the public, who still believes that science should have a high degree of certainty before it becomes worthwhile to listen to. And that's just not the case. Uncertain science is not unreliable. Indeed, we've learned to use uncertainty in very reliable ways. And evolution is maybe a good example of that. I mean, evolution relies entirely on a random process, random mutation. You could never have the diversity of life that we see and the adaptability of life that we see without a random process, in fact. And yet things like species are quite stable. I mean, over the time periods that we're familiar with, of course, there are extinctions and it's very dynamic, but for the most part, things are fairly predictable. And so uncertainties, you know, there's an interesting bit of psychology that came out recently where a group of psychologists came to realize that is somewhat counterintuitive, I think, but that one of the symptoms of depression is certainty. Now, we all think that uncertainty creates anxiety and things like that in people, but in point of fact, certainty, if you think the world is the way it is and there's no opportunity for it to change, if everything is settled, if it's all predicted, then that removes your sense of agency, and that actually leads to a kind of a depressive or pessimistic state, whereas uncertainty is full of possibility. But I don't think we communicate that well these days in science. I think it's one of the great challenges is to bring this notion of uncertainty as a positive, not a negative, into public view and into education for that matter.
Yes, and yeah, evolution is a very important theme in science, and I know that in United States, creationism is a very serious problem, and at the same time, and in United States or also in Japan, so mistrust and ambivalence towards science is growing. It is a very serious problem. What do you think about the source of this such a mistrust and ambivalence towards the science?
Yeah, that's of course a very deep question, I think, and one that we need to examine and explore more thoroughly. My first impression, to build on the uncertainty thing, is that I think we have to be careful as scientists what we promise to the public. I mean, there is this notion that I think among scientists who want to communicate with the public or who are interviewed, that it's better to sound like you know what you're talking about. You know, it's better to sound certain about this. You make a statement and you say, this is the way it is because I'm an authority. But I think we need to learn how to give that up a bit and say there may be multiple ways to think about this. There's a wonderful quote from one of our presidents, Harry Truman, who was not a very quotable president, I have to say, but he was the first president in America to have a science advisor. And at one point he shouted, according to the story, could somebody please find me a one-handed scientist? I want a one-handed scientist. And what he meant by this was his science advisor would come in and give him a long talk, 20 minutes or something, about some issue and all the things about it, and you know what he could do and so forth. And then at the end of it, he'd say, well, but on the other hand, and then give him completely, you know, different advice or another pathway. And this was frustrating him because of course, he wanted to know, what should I do? But we also all know that two hands are better than one. And so I think if we have to be ready to communicate that idea that there are multiple ways to think about things, and science is one of them, and it's a very powerful one, but it's not necessarily the only one. And I don't think we should put ourselves out that way. I don't think that's the correct stance for scientists to take. I think science works best as a combination of hubris and humility. We have tremendous hubris in science. It's the only way we could do it. We believe we can understand the universe. We believe we can understand how things work. We believe we can do experiments and find things out. That's great hubris. It takes that kind of, feeling to come into the lab every morning, because most of your experiments, of course, fail. And at the same time, I think we have a great deal of humility, because we recognize that every time we learn something, all we do is open up 10 new questions. And so there's so much more to learn. But I think it's that balance between hubris and humility that we need to present to the public about science. Sometimes I think it's too much hubris.
And you are a biologist, and biology is called soft science, and physics is hard science. And in biology, there are so many uncertainty. And
I'm sorry, so many, what was that?
Uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So it's much harder to communicate about the biology phenomena than physical phenomena.
Yes, of course, I think that makes biology the harder science and physics the easier one. But we should also remember that physics may be a hard science, and maybe we can communicate a lot about it, but it's also true that 95% of the universe physicists know nothing about, right? It's dark matter and dark energy, and they know nothing about it whatsoever. So all of physics covers 5% of the universe. I think biology is in actually a better position than physics at the moment in that regard.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
Guys, can you wrap up to bring Ayelet back?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Masa, thank you so much. This is a great pleasure. Great pleasure talking with you. Hello, Ayelet. How are you this morning or this afternoon or wherever it is you are? Nice to see you. Ayelet is a wonderful science communicator and also an educator. She's just a fabulous TEDx talk, I guess it is, that I recommend you look up on the internet, in which she really delves deeply into what science education should be. And I think so much we often forget, we talk about science communication, but we often forget that we're talking to a group of people who already have had, 10 or 12 years of schooling in which they've been given a kind of science education that has already set up their ideas about what science is and what it can do. And then we're trying to communicate with them. So, and I have to say, my worry, Ayelet, is, and I think yours as well, is not with how well we educate future scientists. We could talk about that forever, but I think we do fine. But I worry about the 95% of people who are not going to be professional scientists, and for whom their last formal interaction with science was some educational experience in high school or college, some terrible introductory to blah blah course or whatever. So what do you think we can do about that? I mean, what are your ideas about how to fix this part of science communication?
Well, I don't know how to fix it, but I think for many years we had different ideas about what we're trying to get with science education. So what is the goal of science education? And well, many years ago, it was, as you said, maybe the next generation of scientists and engineers, and then came the Science for All movement and the science literacy movement, and suddenly science education is really about educating future citizens. And then the question is, what do we want them to know? So for many years, we thought what we wanted them to know was, a list of things that every citizen should know, right? A list of skills. And then people thought maybe what we need them to be able to do is to read the paper in a critical and a reflective way, right? And I think the idea that I like best now is this idea that what we want is people that can identify when science is relevant to their lives and be able to find credible and good sources of information to use it for their problems. Because it's amazing to think how many times people are encountered with situations in their lives that we as a community think are very science related, and they should go and ask a doctor or find some science evidence, but people don't recognize it as such. So they would use a different type of explanation for how things work, or a different type of authority. So in a way, I think that science education should rethink itself, and we can't really teach people everything they'll need to know, because first of all, there's too much of it, and second, we don't know what they will need to know. But we need to help them have the ability and the motivation to recognize when science is relevant and being able to find this information. I think that would be a start.
Yes, that would be a beautiful start, actually. I couldn't agree more with you. I mean, this is such a that's such a difficult thing to do. It's so much easier to just go to the textbooks. I always think of my humanities colleagues who spend endless hours arguing about what books we should include on the great books list, and it changes. And I think scientists should have that same argument. What is it that's critical for somebody to know? What are the few things? Because otherwise, we'll never cover it all somehow or another, will we? So can I switch topics on you a little bit? Because I know you're also interested in how scientists can be trained to communicate with the public. And I'm very interested in this idea because I think it would be very good for scientists to directly be able to speak to the public. But I'm not sure every scientist is good at that. I mean, it's not really something that's in the good scientist toolkit. Some will be good at it and some will not. It has nothing to do with whether you're a good scientist or not, or capable. So what do you think about it? I mean, should we audition people? Can we train people? What should we do to develop a cadre of science spokespeople that?
When I did my postdoc, my advisor used to say that the essence of science is communication, because if you don't communicate what you find, then it's just written in your journal. You're not really a scientist because you don't contribute at all to the greater knowledge, to humanity's knowledge. So I think basically any scientist communicate, but the question is who they communicate with. So many scientists just communicate with other experts in the same field. And as I can see it, if they publish, then they learn how to communicate with them, right? They know the norms and they do it. So the question is, can all of them, or should all of them, communicate with diverse audiences, right? So that's the question. Now, and of course, there's a few ideas I think we should entertain. First of all, not everybody are good at something. It doesn't mean they can't learn and become better at it, right? So some people have more talent, some people are more open, some people are less, but they can still become better. And I think that having an option, maybe you don't have to, but the option of learning this skill during undergrads or graduate studies, I think that that's something we should offer our students. And a second thing is that in a way, we limit our thinking about communication. Communication is not really only about going and being interviewed on television or writing an op-ed. I mean, communicating with the public and being relevant to the public is also about listening, is also about engaging with people one-on-one, is also about having someone in your lab translate what you did into something teachers can use for teaching. So I think when we think about engagement with the public, not just through the idea of media, but through the idea of engagement and participation and also dissemination, then I think many people can find a way to do that.
I think that's very important. I have to say, I noticed this more and more over the last few years with graduate students in our department where I am, that more and more of them recognize the importance of communication and want to become involved in communication. I mean, we have this word outreach that we call it here, which is, I think, a bit of a corny word, but they're genuinely interested in, in writing essays and doing blogs and showing up at community meetings or things like that, or all sorts of communication things that really interest them. I mean, one of the tricky things, of course, is to get the older faculty of which I'm clearly one, but I'm not that. But to get them to recognize that this is a useful use of their time, let them get away from the bench a little bit and do this. And I think that's part of the thing we have to convince even the scientific establishment of.
Well, it depends really on the norms in the scientific establishment of that community. I mean, we always look for the US and the UK. We in Israel always look to the West and look for the academic norms there. And I must say that in the US and the UK, as much as I can say, the norms are much more positive about communicating with the public. So I would not usually hear people from the UK or the US say, she or he, they are lousy scientists because they spend all their time in studios instead of spending their time in the lab. It's not something you would hear today. Maybe like 40 years. Maybe I'm wrong.
You hear more of it.
And I think in Israel, I mean, you hear it less and less, but we're like a generation behind. So it's really not just about the people themselves and what they want to do, but it's also about the norms that they see around them. So it's both bottom up, but also top down. And that's why I think it's really important that the leadership of the professional communities would state clearly what they see as important use of scientist time, as you said.
Yeah. We're being told to wrap up. I could do this all day with you, but we're being told to wrap up, so we will, and I'll hand it off to you then to complete the circle, and we'll see you later in the panel discussion. Thanks so much, Ayelet.
Great. Thank you so much for tuning into this discussion on science literacy and popularization. To the participants of the Congress, we're going to shuffle over to our other meeting for the breakout groups. And to our public audience, I hope you will join us in 2 hours from now. Is that right? Or is it 3 hours? 2 hours from now for our third session on the risks and dangers of alternative medicine. It starts at noon Eastern Daylight Time. And you can register with the link where you found this one. Thank you so much, Natalia. Anything else?
Yes, please. Since I was such a lousy chair and a very bad replacement for Richard, I just wanted to mention Stuart's books, which I didn't in the introduction. So he has 2 wonderful books on popularization of science and science philosophy. One is called Ignorance, How It Drives Science, and the other is called Failure, Why Science is So Successful. So sorry about that, Stuart. And for those who continue with us, we'll meet in 5 minutes for our discussion sessions, and for the general public, we expect to in 2 hours for our next session on alternative medicine. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.